On September 15, 1950, the tide at Inchon went out and took an American army with it. Loaded landing craft settled onto 2 miles of mudflats under direct artillery fire, and the boldest amphibious gamble of the century died in the harbor it was meant to conquer. For years afterward, planners on both sides of the Cold War would study that afternoon, because it proved something no one in Washington had wanted to believe. A limited war could simply be lost. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The road to that harbor began at dawn on June 25, 1950, when roughly 90,000 North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel behind Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks. The South Korean army, short of artillery and without a single weapon that could reliably stop those tanks, broke within days. Seoul fell. The first American ground unit committed, Task Force Smith, was overrun at Osan on July 5, its recoilless rifles bouncing shells off Soviet armor. Through July and August, American and South Korean forces traded ground for time, falling back down the peninsula until Lieutenant General Walton Walker's 8th Army held only the Pusan perimeter, a pocket roughly 140 miles around in Korea's southeast corner. It's back to the Sea of Japan. Walker fought it like a man plugging a dike with his fingers, shuttling reserves from crisis to crisis along interior rail lines, holding the Naktong River line by margins measured in companies. The perimeter held, barely. But holding was not winning, and in Tokyo, Douglas MacArthur had already decided how the war would be won. What almost no one in his headquarters understood, what would not become clear until the water dropped on a September evening, was how narrow the margin of that plan truly was. Inchon was, by every conventional measure, the worst amphibious target in Korea. Its tidal range approaches 30 feet, among the most extreme in the world. At low water, the harbor becomes a plain of mud stretching for miles, and the tides open only brief windows in which landing craft can reach the shore at all. There were no beaches in any real sense. At Red Beach, Marines would have to scale seawalls with ladders, climbing directly into a city under fire. The approach channel was narrow, easily mined, dominated by the fortified island of Walmi-do. MacArthur saw all of this and wanted it anyway, precisely because it was unthinkable. A landing at Inchon would fall on the enemy's rear, sever the supply lines feeding the assault on Pusan, and recapture Seoul in a single stroke. The Joint Chiefs were unconvinced. In August 1950, Army Chief of Staff J. Lawton Collins and Chief of Naval Operations Forrest Sherman flew to Tokyo to argue for a safer landing site. On August 23, MacArthur answered them with a bravura briefing, telling the assembled officers that the very impracticality of Inchon would guarantee surprise. Rear Admiral James Doyle, the amphibious commander who would have to put the troops ashore, offered the most honest assessment in the room. The best he could say was that Inchon was not impossible. MacArthur called the odds 5,000-1 and took them. Operation Chromite would seize Walmi-do on the morning tide of September 15th, then wait through a long exposed day for the evening tide to carry X-Corps, Major General Edward Almond commanding, built around Major General Oliver P. Smith's 1st Marine Division and the Army's 7th Infantry Division, onto red and blue beaches. It was America's only amphibious reserve. There was no second army behind it. The morning went almost according to plan. Naval gunfire and air strikes hammered Walmi-do, and Marines took the island in under an hour. But in this timeline, the preparatory bombardment fails at its most critical task. A cluster of North Korean batteries, dug into the ridgelines above the harbor and masked from naval observation, survives the suppression fires intact and silent. Their commanders hold fire through the morning. They wait. Then comes the evening tide, and with it, the mistake that breaks the operation. The approach run to Red Beach is mistimed minutes, not hours, but at Inchon minutes are everything. The lead waves touch the seawalls late, and the follow-on waves, packed with the men and vehicles of 2 Marine regiments, are still churning across the harbor as the water begins to drop. The hidden batteries open fire at last, walking shells across the channel. Coxswains throttle forward, trying to beat the falling tide, and one by one the landing craft ground on the emerging mudflats, stranded, immobile, perfectly registered targets in the last light of day. There is no cover on a mudflat. There is no retreat across 2 miles of waist-deep sludge. The craft are destroyed piecemeal through the evening, burning in lines across the flats, while the Marines already ashore at Red Beach fight on the wrong side of a seawall with no reinforcement coming. Near midnight, Doyle makes the only decision the sea leaves him. He halts the operation. 2 Marine regiments are broken, and Operation Chromite is over. The withdrawal took 3 days. Under cover of naval gunfire, the fleet pulled survivors off Woolmeadow and the Red Beach foothold, leaving the flats littered with burned-out craft visible at every low tide, a photograph that would run on every front page on Earth. The 1st Marine Division, the finest amphibious formation in the American arsenal, was combat ineffective. The casualty lists reaching Washington were the worst for a single American operation since Okinawa. The strategic wreckage was larger still. MacArthur's authority, built across a decade on the claim that his judgment ran ahead of Washington's caution, collapsed overnight. The man who had overridden the Joint Chiefs now owned the consequence. And those same Joint Chiefs, vindicated in the cruelest possible way, inherited the ruins of American strategy with no reserve left to rebuild it. George Marshall, sworn in as Secretary of Defense on September 21st amid the recriminations, understood immediately what the maps showed. Everything now depended on Walker's tired divisions at Pusan and on how quickly Kim Il-sung grasped what Inchon's failure had given him. The answer to that question would arrive within 3 weeks, and it would put 2 very different pieces of paper on the president's desk. Inchon had been meant to do 2 things: cut the North Korean supply line and force Kim Il-sung to look over his shoulder. Its failure did the opposite. The NKPA divisions ringing Pusan, which in the real timeline disintegrated when Seoul fell behind them, instead received replacements, ammunition, and the electric news that the Americans had been thrown back into the sea. Stalin, still determined to avoid direct war, quietly accelerated deliveries of artillery and armor. Kim Il-sung ordered the final offensive. It fell on the Naktong line in the 2nd week of October. Walker fought as he had all summer, shifting his reserves along the rail lines from breach to breach. But the 8th Army had been consuming itself since July, and the strategic distraction that was supposed to relieve it lay burned on the Inchon flats. Near Taegu, the line cracked. Not everywhere and not all at once, but a breach in a perimeter that small cannot be sealed by men who no longer exist. Through late October, the pocket contracted, division by division, ridge by ridge, toward the port of Pusan itself. Walker's engineers began surveying the harbor for demolition. The question in Washington was no longer whether the bridgehead could be saved. It was what America was prepared to do about losing it. By the 1st week of November, Harry Truman faced a choice with no precedent in American history. On his desk lay a Navy plan for the full evacuation of Korea and admission, in cold logistical prose, that the United States and the United Nations had committed an army to the mainland of Asia and lost. Beside it lay the alternative pressed by Curtis LeMay, commander of Strategic Air Command, who had argued since the summer that atomic firepower could substitute for the ground forces America did not have. His proposal was specific: atomic strikes on North Korean troop concentrations above the perimeter and on the supply centers feeding the offensive. The United States held roughly 300 atomic bombs. It could spare a dozen. Marshall counseled against it, and his reasoning was not moral but ruthlessly practical. Atomic bombs, he argued, could not save the bridgehead. The NKPA was dispersed, dug in, and intermingled with a countryside full of refugees, and no target set within range of the perimeter would stop the offensive in time. The Soviet Union had tested its own device in August 1949. The American monopoly was already gone, and spending the deterrent against a secondary enemy would teach the world that the weapon could be used and survived. Worst of all were the armies massing in Manchuria, where Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai had watched every week of the UN collapse. Atomic fire on the Yalu's doorstep might hand Stalin the wider war he was so carefully avoiding, with Chinese soldiers as the instrument. Truman listened to both papers. Then he chose. Truman rejected atomic use and ordered the evacuation. What followed, through November and December of 1950, was the largest rescue operation in American military history, and it was conducted under fire the entire way. The Navy massed everything that could float off Pusan, attack transports, LSTs, freighters, Japanese crewed merchantmen pressed into service. Battleship and cruiser gunfire laid a curtain of steel across the shrinking perimeter, while a rearguard, Walker's most intact divisions, and South Korean units fighting for their national existence held the hills above the port. The lift ran day and night. More than 100,000 soldiers came out, along with hundreds of thousands of Korean refugees who crowded every pier and clung to every gangway, choosing the open sea over what was coming. The transports shuttled to Japan and turned around and came back. The perimeter contracted to the city, then to the harbor district, then to the waterfront itself. In Christmas week, with the last rearguard battalions backing onto the final quays under small arms fire, engineers demolished the last pier behind them. The evacuation was, by any technical measure, a masterpiece. It was also the first time in the 20th century that the United States had been driven from a war it had chosen to fight. MacArthur was relieved within weeks, recalled to an America that could not decide whether he was a scapegoat or the author of the disaster, and he retired into a bitter celebrity of speaking tours and memoirs, relitigating the tides of Inchon for the rest of his life. Washington's answer to defeat was not withdrawal from the world, but the opposite. NSC 68, the strategy paper that had languished through 1950, became gospel overnight. Within 2 years, the defense budget had tripled, and the half-mobilized America of 1950 gave way to a permanent war economy. Japan, now the front line rather than the rear area, became the fortified anchor of the Pacific, garrisoned, rear-mid in all but name, and bound to Washington by treaty and necessity. Kim Il-sung ruled a unified Korea as the Soviet bloc's showcase, though the peninsula's ports and airfields now faced an American arsenal larger than anything the Pacific had ever seen. But the deepest change was not in budgets or bases. It was in doctrine. Both sides absorbed the lesson of Pusan, that a limited war could be lost outright, in full view of the world, without the loser reaching for its ultimate weapons. That lesson cut two ways. It made the great powers more cautious about where they committed armies and more determined never again to be caught with too few. The Cold War's dividing lines hardened into fortifications, and the generation that followed lived in a world armed by a defeat. History remembers Inchon as a miracle because the tide, the timing, and the guns aligned for a few hours on a September evening. It is worth remembering how little had to change, a battery unsuppressed, a landing wave a few minutes late for the miracle to become the mudflats. The margin between them was the width of a falling tide.